Well, good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. This is Friday, August 2. We've actually reached the month of August, the month of the dog days, the month of the heat. Our air conditioner was just running. It shut off just a few moments ago, but it'll probably come back on pretty soon. You might even be able to hear it. I paid attention to some of our recordings. I played back some recordings last week looking at some of the stuff from about a year ago or older, and you can definitely hear that furnace slash air conditioner when it's running. It's not too distracting, but you can tell when it's going. We don't have a official warm soundproof studio here, like you would at a radio station or something, where they make sure that the HVAC is far enough away that the microphones don't pick it up. Anyway, so it has been hot. I was lucky this week. It was the week. I usually do this every other week to take care of mowing the grass, the lawn, and you you want to do that early in the day so that you aren't out mowing when it is blazing hot in the afternoon. But the problem is that if you start too early, oftentimes the grass is dewy and wet, and it's not good to mow. It's not good for the mower. It's not good for the grass, either one, to mow it when it's too wet. But I went out Wednesday to do this, and while I was working, looking around to see if it could be done early, it looked to me like it was dry enough. So I went to work. I did a little work on clearing some of the junk that collects on our driveway, um, getting that bagged up, and then I used the string trimmer. And 2 weeks ago, I had run out of string 2 weeks before that, so 4 weeks before this week, and had forgotten to buy more string for the trimmer. So I ran out 2 weeks ago before I was done, and so some of the trimming didn't get done 2 weeks ago. So I did a pretty thorough job of trimming this Wednesday. And before I got done, my wife's brother showed up. He comes over from time to time, and his sister, my wife, shows him um, things that he can do in games because he likes to play some of the same games that she does, and she's played them.
Several months back, Dragon Quest Builders, along with Dragon Quest Builders 2. And he's working on the first one, Dragon Quest Builders. And I was just showing him some things I had figured out that makes the game a bit easier in some of the more difficult places.
Yeah, and plus, then you got him to start a game that you have played through a few times that you like, and I don't think he even knew about it before you showed it to him, did he?
I don't think so.
Anyway, so and it was
But
our
difficulty, like you and I sometimes have, in that uh, the the access was not what I don't know how to say it. Um, the controllers didn't work the way he wanted them to work.
ah
Kind of like he's used to playing Final Fantasy VII, the original.
mm-hmm.
You can't play that because it doesn't work the way you want it to.
Yeah.
I can't play it anymore because of that.
Well, anyway, that's what went on Monday. We had, and we won't go into the details of this. We had a home health nurse show up, and then on Tuesday he sent a physical therapist. He taught my wife a few exercises she could do there in or near her chair to help keep her blood circulating and her activity up where she doesn't end up totally infirm. So she's working on a few things. So that's kind of been our week here. And I'm going to tell a little story on her. And this is about the dangers of eating in the dark.
Uh-oh.
Yesterday evening, sometime, she asked me for dessert. Now, we are on a low carb diet, so we don't eat sugary desserts.
We don't eat sugar, period.
Right. So, but she has kind of developed a recipe, and I figured out how to do it. That involves cream cheese, powdered cocoa, which just by nature is low carb. They you know, when you use it, you have to sweeten it some way. So they don't put sugar in the powdered cocoa. And so we use that, the cream cheese. We sweeten it with stevia, and then we add some sugar-free chocolate chips and some chopped walnuts, and mix it all up, and that's a dessert. Some of you might not.
An acquired taste. Don't go try making it and think, oh, that sounds wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. It's not the traditional dessert, but it's something that we like. And so she had asked me for that, and I went in the kitchen to get started on it, and the cats needed to be fed, and I got involved with the cats, and being old, it slipped my mind that's what I was going to do. So later I come back to the room, and she's asking me, am I getting chocolate? I'm like, I was sleepy, I needed a nap. I got up later, I decided to feed her, so I went in. Well, one of the things that she asked for this week, and that I bought the stuff for, was vegetable beef stew. So I bought some vegetables, and I bought some stew meat, and put them on the stove, chopped up the veggies, added some onion and tomato along with the broccoli cauliflower mix and some zucchini, and put it in a pot of water on the stove to boil for about 4 hours. So she had had a bowl of it, but there was more, so I had set it in the fridge, and so I pulled it out and warmed it up in the microwave and put a spoon in it and brought the bowl to her with a napkin. And then I intended to go back and make the chocolate she had asked for. But it didn't dawn on me to warn her, and well, you might accuse me of doing this intentionally. I will say I didn't do it intentionally, but you can believe what you want. I put it in the same kind of bowl that I usually make that dessert in, the chocolate dessert. So I handed her the bowl, and she got the spoon out and scooped it, and thought it looked kind of funny, put it in her mouth, and what she got was a sprig of cauliflower out of that vegetable beef stew. And she almost spit it out because it was not the taste she was expecting. She did figure out before she spit it out what it was she had, and she did eat it. It did fill her, and she did get her dessert too. So, yeah.
That kind of diet, where it's high protein like that, cuts the cravings for sugar. And it only took, that little bowl of stew and a few bites of the dessert, and I was stuffed for 12 hours.
Yeah. So, that's life in our household this week, and I think we're ready to move on. We'll discuss a few things before we move too far, but let's bow our heads before we begin. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings, and we thank you for the written word, for the record of your dealings with humanity over the centuries and millennia of life on this planet. We understand that you love us. You want to fix what's broken about this world. We want to be part of that. We want to be part of your solution. We want to help our fellow humans achieve what you intended for us to have. And we're going to open the written word. We know that it is limited, but we believe that in it we can be led to you and the truth about your character, and that's what we want to do as we study during this Friday night Bible study. So we ask the Holy Spirit will come and dwell with each person who hears this. That they will be enabled to receive a blessing and to come to know you better, and to come to have better compassion for their fellow humans as a result of our study. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
I tried to say something earlier. You talked over me.
I'm sorry, what'd you want to say?
You were saying that today is August 2.
Yep.
And I said it's Dentist Day.
It is what?
Dentist Day.
Dentist, as in fix your teeth?
Yeah.
Oh.
It's the 2 of August.
Oh. Well, okay. Well, last week we read Exodus chapter 20 and the first section of Exodus chapter 21. And we talked quite a bit about the Ten Commandments because they're found there in chapter 20. And then we got into some of the other rules that were involved and the things that were said following the big flash and awe presentation on the mountaintop, and how the people went to Moses and said, this is frightening. In future, you talk to us. Don't let God talk to us because we're scared. Moses told them not to be afraid and said, well, God did this so that you would obey his law and respect him, not be afraid of him. And that's the unfortunate thing that happens when we end up translating the Hebrew there as we do. We call it fear. Don't be afraid, fear God. Huh? Well, don't be afraid, respect, reverence God. If we would say it that way, it might make a little more sense. Be amazed that the, go ahead.
Perfect love casts out all fear.
Right. Be amazed that the creator of the universe, the one potentially with all power, operates on the principles of love and is well intentioned to those that he has created. He's not demanding, he's not controlling. So that might be a better way to understand that. Now, there are approximately 20 verses there in Exodus chapter 20 that comprise the Ten Commandments. And yet, in the modern Christian world, it's almost like as if the Ten Commandments are the central point of the Bible. How do we get there? It's just a few verses as part of a very large, lengthy, multiple verses book. How did that passage come to take such huge significance to where, people are saying we need to post the Ten Commandments in schools, we need to post them in the courtrooms. And you had the incident with the judge in Alabama who actually had a large stone monument of the Ten Commandments erected in his courtroom, and got told by the Supreme Court that he had to take it down. In our own state, they put up a monument of the Ten Commandments on the state capitol grounds. And somebody who was had a rather tenuous grasp on reality took his car and drove straight into the thing at some point. Anyway, I was, those few verses have taken on a significance for much of Christianity far beyond how often they're mentioned in the Bible. And how did it get like that? Well, I wasn't there, I can't tell you, but let me suggest something that I have heard that may have something to do with it. This was the initial contact between God and his people once he rescued them from slavery in Egypt. So it had significance for the Hebrews at that point. But we're about to go through a section of Exodus and then sections of the other books that include lots of rules and regulations and laws that the people were expected to follow. And why should this short portion have such great significance? Until you reach the point about 1,000 years later, when these people, the Hebrew people, the nation of Israel, God's chosen people at that point in history, kept having trouble avoiding idolatry and living life the way their Creator intended them to live. And the Creator kept sending messengers to them, prophets, trying to call them back to Him and warning them that given where they lived in the world, that if they kept ignoring Him and lost His protection, they would end up in trouble. And the trouble ended up being in the form of captivity to the king of the nation of Babylon, one Nebuchadnezzar, who went to Jerusalem and kept taking people from Jerusalem to Babylon. And when the people wouldn't, when the kings would not follow their agreements to submit to him, he'd come and take more people. And the third time around, he took all but the very poorest people with him off to Babylon and essentially sacked the city of Jerusalem, destroyed it because of their refusal to submit to him, even though through the prophets the Creator was telling them that if they wanted to survive, they really needed to submit to him. And so all these things happened. And so for 70 years roughly, the Hebrew people lived in Babylon. Now, Babylon was an established culture that had been around for much longer than the Hebrew people. And they had a history of their own as innovators in this whole issue of government. And perhaps you have heard of the Code of Hammurabi. It is considered in today's world one of the major innovations in the issue of government, and that is the concept of the rule of law. And this code was developed. It was a basic, fundamental code that laid out the core regulations regarding social life to forbid such things as murder and so on. So, and this was a very big deal with the Chaldeans, who we know as the Babylonians. And so some scholars have suggested that during this time period, the Hebrews began to look at themselves and their own nationality and thinking about this whole concept of law, and they began to think, well, look, we have our own Hammurabi of sorts. We have Moses. Moses gave us a law very similar to the code of Hammurabi. And so it was at this point then that the Ten Commandments began to take on a much greater deal of significance for the Hebrews than possibly it had up to that point. And so when we get to the New Testament, we hear the New Testament writers talking about the law, and the way they say it, and the way Jesus himself talked about the law makes it relatively clear that he's talking about the Ten Commandments. Well, Jesus would have spoken to the people using language and concepts that they understood. At one point, he said, and we have identified 3 human institutions that they aren't God's way of doing things, but he allows because they have been put there to prevent the worst results of human brokenness. And those 3 institutions are government, commerce, or the whole idea of buying and selling, and religion, to bring us to God. God wants us to have a personal relationship with him, and yes, we can get together and express our devotion to God in a social setting. That's acceptable, but this concept of organized religion with doctrines and rules and all this stuff, that's kind of anathema to God. But God allows these things, and he sends messages that we should obey those who have been set in power over us in these institutions. So Jesus said once regarding commerce, give to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar, and to God the things that belong to God. Paul writes that every soul should be subject to the higher powers, and he's talking about the government of the time, the Roman government. And Jesus, once as he was issuing his warnings about the spiritual poverty of the Pharisees, said that these lawyers and religious leaders sit in Moses' seat. So you need to listen to them, and you need to do what they tell you to do. But don't do what they do, because they don't practice what they preach. So we understand that these institutions aren't God's ideal, but we don't throw them out of our lives and blatantly thumb our noses at them, because that wouldn't be acting out of love. So at any rate, I'm going over this to suggest why the Ten Commandments seem to have taken on such a big significance in our modern religious culture. And I think there is an understanding that if you're going to deal with human brokenness through law, that the laws represented in the Ten Commandments, like the laws in the Code of Hammurabi, are kind of basic and fundamental to protecting people's rights in a broken human system. Now, the other issue that we run into, and that's in verses 1 through 11 of chapter 21, the verses that we read before we closed last week, were these regulations regarding slaves, specifically Hebrew slaves. A male Hebrew slave could serve for no more than 6 years. In the 7th year, he would go free. Now, if he was single, he would leave single. If he was married, his wife had to be free with him. However, if he got married while he was a slave, if his master gave him a wife, then he got to keep the wife, and only the male slave went free. But if the slave said he wanted his wife and he wanted his children, he could commit himself to his master for life. He could go to the doorpost and his ear would be bored through with an awl to mark him as the master's slave for life. And this would be done in the presence of the leaders of the community so that everybody knew that this is something that the slave agreed to do. And we talked a little bit about the misogyny inherent in these rules, because we get down here to verse 7 and it says, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, and let's go ahead and bring up the text here so you can see it. She will not be freed at the end of 6 years as the men are, if she does not satisfy her owner, suggesting that she may have been a sexual slave, and if he takes her as a sexual slave and then he isn't pleased with her, he must allow her to be bought back again. But if he is not allowed to sell her, to foreigners, since he is the one who broke the contract with her. But if the slave's owner arranges for her to marry his son, he may no longer treat her as a slave, but as a daughter. And we have discussed in the past, and we'll probably mention this again and again as we go through this, that one of the ways a lot of people look at all these rules and regulations is not as expressing God's ideal, but rather as putting limits on some of the abuses that were common in the day. So one of the common abuses was slavery and being slaves for life. And the Israelites had just gotten out of a situation where they'd been made slaves for life. You couldn't get out. God says it's not going to be that way with you. If you take a fellow Hebrew as a slave to pay back a debt, you can't hold him as a servant for any longer than 6 years. In the 7th year, he needs to go free. And in fact, the tradition of indentured servitude that was part of the founding of this nation, where someone would offer their labor for 7 years to somebody and use that to gain passage to this country from the old world. That is based in part on this passage right here, this first section out of Exodus chapter 21. I once prepared a sermon, presented it several times, on this topic, founded on a passage in the book of Psalms. And I'd like to read that psalm for you at this point and briefly discuss the ideas that I presented in that sermon. The psalm in question is Psalm 123, and I'm going to read it here from the New International Version. It is titled, or it is subtitled, A Song of Ascents, and apparently that is a poetic form that the Hebrews used a lot. So in this section, you will see that in a lot of these, chapters 120 through 126, all of them are songs of ascents, as is this one, Psalm 123. I lift up my eyes to you whose throne is in the heaven, or is in heaven, rather. As the eyes of slaves look to the hand of their master, as the eyes of a maid look to the hand of her mistress, so our eyes look to the Lord our God till he shows us his mercy. Well, obviously back then, slavery was something that happened from time to time. It was an idea that the people were familiar with, so the psalmist uses it to express the relationship between God and his people. And we are dependent on our Creator for our very lives. We're dependent on him for the air that we breathe, the sunshine that makes our food grow. All of these things are gifts to us from the Creator. So as we worship the Creator, we look to him much as a slave or maid would look to the one who provides them the things they need to live. And I think that's kind of the idea that's being expressed here. And then I would go to this passage in Exodus 21, and I would read this, and I would put emphasis on this concept in verses 5 and 6, where it says, after that, the slave will serve his master for life. That in our relationship with God, in our relationship of dependence upon God, we become his dependents for life. Yes. She's not on the phone right now. I'm going to pause this for just a moment. We'll find out what she needs.
Sorry about that.
Okay, we got that taken care of, so we're ready to move on. So we were talking about how our dependence on God, our relationship with him, is a lifetime thing, and that we see shades of that relationship here in this provision of the Hebrew slave law in Exodus 21. And then I would go on and read the rest of the psalm. Here is one of the things that we look to our Creator to get for us. And this is only a 4-verse psalm, so we've read the first two, now we read the last two. Have mercy on us, O Lord. Have mercy on us, for we have endured much contempt. We have endured much ridicule from the proud, much contempt from the arrogant. And I read those words and I think, that's a description of toxic people. And we all, from time to time in our lives, come in contact with toxic people who make trouble for us. And if we are in right relationship with God, then we take those matters to God and we leave dealing with the toxic people in our lives with God, and like a slave, we look to God for relief from the trouble that's being sent our way by the toxic people who think they're more important than we are.
One thing that helps is to have a proper understanding of what forgiveness means.
Well, yes, because the forgiveness, a lot of times, abusive people, if you assert your right to avoid them or to leave them and not have them in your lives anymore, they get panicky because they're addicted to the control that they have over you, that their abuse of you gives them. They don't want to lose it. So then they come to you and they say, well, please forgive me. Well, forgiveness isn't for their benefit. Forgiveness is for your benefit, so that you give up the resentment and the bitterness that will destroy your life if you don't let go of it. That's why you forgive. But forgiving them does not mean you trust them. if they have broken your trust, then until they can prove over a lengthy period of time that they can be trusted, you don't let them back in your life.
It does not mean restored. No, I've just lost the word.
Restored relationship.
Yes.
You may need to keep them out of your life for the rest of your life and their life because they can't be trusted. You have forgiven them, but forgiveness doesn't mean trust. Trust must be earned. And if they haven't earned trust, and they're not going to do that by coming to you and apologizing and saying, I'm sorry, and begging you to forgive them. Yeah, I've forgiven you, but I don't trust you. You're not coming back into my life until you have demonstrated that you can be trusted. And that would save a lot of women in our society from being battered. You know, their significant other, well, some men too. Their significant other batters them, domestic violence, and in the fright and fear of the moment, they call the police, and the police come and haul the person off to jail, and the guy shows up before the judge or the lady, because men and women both end up with domestic violence charges against them. And the victim, the complaining witness, comes in and says they want them back. And they end up getting battered for more and longer because they're in what we sometimes call a codependent relationship. They know they're being battered, but they're addicted to what little bit of affirmation they get in that relationship. So after the fright and fear of the moment are over, then they want the person back.
So tell me something. Once upon a time, several years ago, I had an elderly friend who needed to go to the doctor, and her husband didn't feel well enough to drive her. So they called me and asked if I could take her, which I agreed to do. While sitting in the waiting room, a couple came in, a man and a woman. She sat there crying. And it was just the four of us there in the waiting room, and he was paying me no attention whatsoever. And he was trying to talk to her, and she was ignoring him. And he finally, I heard him say to her, I only hit you to try to help you. I didn't mean to hurt you.
Yeah.
Yeah, now what should I have done in that situation? I know what I did.
What you did?
But what should I have done? In your opinion?
In my opinion? Well, I don't know. In situations like that, and this is just because of my own personality and my penchant to avoid confrontation, I would say this is their life, let them sort it out.
Well, I gave him a dirty look. I had eye contact with him and gave him a dirty look. And he shut up. I didn't say anything, but then when they got called back, I went up and I reported it to the receptionist.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time they got out, I was in the back room with my friend.
Yeah.
The receptionist said she would pass the message on to the doctor.
So after that, you don't know what happened.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that is human brokenness.
I have a background where I have worked in doctor's offices. And at one time, we had a patient that kept coming in with bruises. And she was battered by her husband.
Mm-hmm.
I quit and moved away to a different state. However, the message came to me a few months later that he did eventually beat her to death.
Yeah.
Um, I think because of that, I couldn't keep my mouth shut.
Yeah.
Because I felt like this woman's in danger. I have to do something.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that is why, and unfortunately, over the years, a lot of Christian religious leaders, preachers, if you wish, have advised women not to leave their husbands because of the expectation that divorce is terrible. Don't ever do it. So they,
The boss.
yeah.
He's in charge. You do what he says.
So they spiel this nonsense out, and women end up going back to their abusers when they shouldn't, and getting further abused. And when they are abused, that generates sin. So essentially, what these preachers are doing when they tell women to go back to their husbands is they're telling them to get involved in more sin. And preachers should not be doing that. Sorry, I got a little.
And then you find yourself in a culture where when a woman is raped,
Oh, well,
she's
she
killed.
asked for it.
She's put to death for the act of adultery.
Yeah. And we'll get to laws about that.
Honor
And
killing.
see what protections were put in place in the laws for Israel against some of these things, given the nature of the culture and the kinds of things that the people in this part of the world were wont to do. And I say want there, WONT, likely predisposed to do. So, moving on then, and I have an idea that our next sermon presentation is going to address this issue of what the Bible says about slavery and how we relate that to our modern expectation that slavery is anathema to God because it robs a human being that God has created of the liberty he made them to have. Moving on then, verse 12, which is subtitled in this version, Causes of Personal Injury. And it is here that we will find the first expression, explicit expression in the Old Testament of what's sometimes called the lex talionis, or the law of retribution. And it will be stated in here in explicit terminology. And when we get there, then we'll recall what Jesus said about it. Anyone who assaults and kills another person must be put to death. But if it was simply an accident permitted by God, I will appoint a place of refuge where the slayer can run for safety. However, if someone deliberately kills another person, then the slayer must be dragged even from my altar and be put to death. Now, this is another thing that we have not encountered yet in the Old Testament, but that we will run across multiple times as we go through the stories of the Old Testament. And the concept is, and this probably comes from the pagan culture around them, that if you wanted to save your life, you would go and take hold of the most sacred object in the culture, the altar to the God of your nation, of your culture. And so we will read places where people went and took hold of the altar in the Hebrew sanctuary, trying to save their lives, and in some cases it didn't work. And that action is specifically allowed in this law, because if a murder was intentional, then the slayer is to face justice in the form of the death penalty, even if they must be dragged from the altar. Now, does this say here that God, as some people will tell you, that God demands the death penalty in the case of murder? Or, as we are doing here with the other laws, are we saying that this is a safeguard that God is putting in place? And we'll read more about it later. The whole idea that if a member of your family was killed, one of you in the family will be designated the avenger of blood and will be tasked with finding the person responsible for the death and killing them. And the whole system of cities of refuge, which is being hinted at here when it says in verse 13, a place of refuge, was put in place to allow people who accidentally killed someone to be spared and to be protected from this avenger of blood system. You will not find anywhere in all these rules in the Old Testament a specific statement of the avenger of blood system other than in the rules which put limits on it. So this is clearly something that the Hebrews inherited from the culture around them, and God says, well, okay, if you're going to do it, but here are the limitations on that. Anyone who strikes father or mother must be put to death. And some people have related this to the culture of that part of the world, which even today in some of these countries in the Middle East, a grocer made the mistake of placing celery and tomatoes next to each other in his display case, and the authorities said that might make somebody think of male genitalia. This is an inappropriate thing, and they hauled the grocer off and executed him for the crime of displaying these things next to each other. Well,
they executed everybody that worked there.
Did they?
But who was it that thought? Who was it that came up with the idea that it looked like that?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of warped thinking going on there.
The one who was perverted was the one who did the executing.
Well, sure, yeah. Kidnappers must be put to death whether they are caught in possession of their victims or have already sold them as slaves. Anyone who dishonors father or mother must be put to death. They've got a footnote there for that word dishonors. And it says anyone who speaks disrespectfully of, that's the Greek version, and they suggest we compare some New Testament texts where Jesus mentions this regulation.
Respect and honor are two different things.
Mm-hmm. All right, verse 18. Now suppose two men quarrel, and one hits the other with a stone or fist, and the injured person does not die, but is confined to bed. If he is later able to walk outside again, even with a crutch, the assailant will not be punished, but must compensate his victim for lost wages and provide for his full recovery. Now, here's one of the rules where we get the concept of what God considers justice to be. If you injure someone, then it becomes your duty, a requirement on you, to compensate them and to do whatever you can to restore to them what was lost. compensate for lost wages, provide for his full recovery. So this is here not lex talionis, but rather a law of justice, of restoring what was lost. And perhaps that's part of the concept behind the death penalty for murder thing, that you can't restore somebody else's life, so you cannot honor the law of justice and restoration in that case. Verse 20. If a man beats his male or female slave with a club and the slave dies as a result, the owner must be punished. It doesn't say killed, it says punished, but if it's death, you would think that the law already referenced would apply. But if the slave recovers within a day or two, then the owner shall not be punished, since the slave is his property. That sounds pretty wrong to us, but anyway. Now, suppose two men are fighting, and in the process they accidentally strike a pregnant woman, so she gives birth prematurely, or C, she has a miscarriage. The Hebrew reads, so her children come out. Different people will interpret that section differently. If no further injury results, the man who struck the woman must pay the amount of compensation the woman's husband demands and the judges approve. So both the husband and the judges have a say. The husband doesn't get to make any demand he wants. The judges determine what the husband can demand, but this law allows him to demand payment for what happened to his wife. But if there is further injury, the punish must match the injury. A life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, a bruise for a bruise. So this is the explicit statement of what we call the lex talionis, the law of retribution. That is that if you injure someone, you must be injured in the same way you injured the person, which can lead to a lot of one-eyed people if you're playing the eye for an eye game a lot. No, yeah. Makes me think of the saying, in the world of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. There's an interesting story that goes with that saying, but I won't get into that now. But you'd have a lot of one-eyed people if you followed this rule too specifically. And what did Jesus say about it? What'd you say?
There is none so blind as he who cannot see.
Who will not see.
Will not see.
Yeah, if you choose not to see, you're blinder than the people who can't see. A quick reference, we should know where this is, but in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus goes over some of the traditions of the Hebrew religious system and some of the laws. And in chapter 5, he says, and this is in verse 38, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. And in doing that, he's quoting the verse we just read, verse 24 here in Exodus 21. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. So Jesus specifically countermanded this Old Testament lex talionis, or law of retribution, in what he said, there as recorded in the book of Matthew. So when somebody tells you that the Bible doesn't contradict itself, yes, it does, very specifically. Jesus, in that case, very specifically contradicted the law we just read, the lex talionis. He said, no, don't do it that way. Well, why would that be? Well, because God is dealing with the people at the level they are capable of relating to Him. And at this point in Israelite history, they are at an exceptionally low level of moral development. So He has to give them laws that they can relate to, not the laws that He would prefer. If a man hits his male or female slave, this is verse 26, in the eye, and the eye is blinded, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And if a man knocks out the tooth of his male or female slave, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth.
I'm sure that back in those days, teeth were rare and they needed everyone they had.
Yeah. Well, they didn't have dentists and they didn't have falsies, etc. Yeah.
And they didn't have the second day of the month.
And I think I've mentioned this before. I have a tooth that's knocked out of alignment there. This happened in the last couple of years. And in the period since then, I have learned what a blessing it was for most of my life to have my teeth be so straight. Because now as I eat, sometimes I bite into something and it doesn't come loose. Because there's that gap there in my teeth, and it's frustrating. So I can imagine what it would be like for somebody to lose a tooth.
What happened to your tooth?
The tooth that's out of line,
Yeah.
it just all of a sudden decided it didn't want to be in line with the other teeth. The teeth were too crowded. I've got all of my, all four of my wisdom teeth, and I don't have a big enough jaw, so everything's so tight in there, and this just hopped inside, and the other teeth started closing in around it in front of it, and
Yeah, I remember you telling me that.
yeah.
Showing.
So that's part of life now that I have to live with. I looked into getting it fixed, going to an orthodontist and getting the tooth straightened. And it was going to cost a lot of money, and I was already retired, and I didn't want to lose that much money that quick, that early in my retirement, so I'm living with it. My choice, not somebody else's. Reading on, verse 28.
Retirement is not cheap.
No, but I look at it and I say, compared with some people, we have it pretty good. We have enough to eat. We have a house to live in. We can afford our bills right now. We're doing okay. And I think that's something to be grateful for. So.
Well, I think I'll go run up the credit card then. Solve that problem.
If an ox gores a man or woman to death, footnote there, D, or bull or cow, also in verses 29 to 36. So if an ox gores a man or woman to death, the ox must be stoned, and its flesh may not be eaten. In such a case, however, the owner will not be held liable. But suppose the ox had a reputation for goring, and the owner had been informed but failed to keep it under control. If the ox then kills someone, it must be stoned, and the owner must also be put to death. However, the dead person's relatives may accept payment to compensate for the loss of life. The owner of the ox may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded.
This reminds me of a lawsuit that I actually sat in on. I went to somebody else's hearing. at request, just to show support for the people.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lawsuit going on at the time. Somebody had a herd of cattle, and the cows kept getting out of the fence, and neighbors kept complaining to the people and kept calling the police about these free roaming cattle, and he was warned several times, and eventually, guess what happened? There was a car cow accident, and he was being sued. And his defense was, it's not my fault because I had the fence repaired. And the judge wanted to know when he had it repaired.
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of hesitated and says, well, I don't remember the date. Well, do you have any proof that you had it repaired? So he produced a receipt that the fence was repaired after the accident.
Ah. Locking the barn door after the horse got out, huh?
I never found out the outcome of that. The judge tabled it for a few minutes while he went back to talk to the people that I was there to support,
Mm-hmm.
finish their case, and asked us to leave.
So you didn't get to go back in and see what became of the other case.
No. But we were talking about it afterwards, wanting to know, you know, we wanted to stay in here and hear about that cow. What happened?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We never found out.
Verse 31. The same regulation applies if the ox gores a boy or a girl. But if the ox gores a slave, either male or female, the animal's owner must pay the slave's owner 30 silver coins, and the ox must be stoned. Suppose someone digs or uncovers a pit and fails to cover it, and then an ox or a donkey falls into it. The owner of the pit must pay full compensation to the owner of the animal, but then he gets to keep the dead animal. If someone's ox injures a neighbor's ox and the injured ox dies, then the two owners must sell the live ox and divide the price equally between them. They must also divide the dead animal. But if the ox had a reputation for goring, yet its owner failed to keep it under control, he must pay full compensation. A live ox for the dead one, but he may keep the dead ox. And that's the end of chapter 21. Moving forward. And we're going to go, there's two more chapters, 22 and 23, which are, and this isn't going anywhere. Let me try again. There we go. Are going to have more laws like this. So we read about slaves, we read about injury law or tort law, and now we're going to read about protection of property. So, verse 22 starts with a footnote A, which when we scroll down says, verse 22:1 is numbered 2137 in the Hebrew text. And I'm not sure because the Hebrew text wasn't initially divided and numbered, so I'm not sure what significance it is to where the divisions are put in the Hebrew text over in the English text, because they're all after the fact additions. So, but anyway. If someone steals an ox or a sheep, and that ox footnote is probably the same thing as before, because we know that cows can gore. I remember I used to work for a dairy farmer in Michigan, north of Wisconsin, where Wisconsin is dairy country. So is that part of Michigan up north of Wisconsin. It's still dairy country. So I was working for a dairy farmer there, and he sent me out to to the pasture where he kept his freshening cows until they delivered. And a cow had just delivered, and he sent me out there to get the calf. So I went out there, and here's the new calf on the ground, and the mother's there looking, and the other cows are all in a circle looking at this thing, sniffing it and all this stuff. That's how cows will do. And so I walked up there, and I'm standing there watching the calf for a moment before I pick it up and put it in the wheelbarrow to haul it up to the barn. And one of the cows thought I was in the way, so she took her head and pushed me aside. And the nubs on her head went right up my leg. And I thought about that, and I thought, if this cow hadn't been dehorned, I might be hurting now. And cows, like oxen, have horns. So if a cow hits you that way, a cow can gore you just as much as a male cow. So that's why I think that reference is put there, because probably the original Hebrew meant any cow that has horns and can gore. If someone steals an ox or sheep and then kills or sells it, the thief must pay back 5 oxen for each ox stolen and 4 sheep for each sheep stolen. I suppose somebody could make something about the idea here that the oxen is worth 5-fold restitution, but the sheep's only worth 4-fold restitution. But I'm not going to be the one to come up with that. I don't know. If a thief is caught in the act of breaking into a house and is struck and killed in the process, and I'll put your footnote C has to do with the numbering. Yes. Whoop-de-doo. If a thief is caught in the act of breaking into a house and is struck and killed in the process, the person who killed the thief is not guilty of murder. And we have those kinds of laws in our country. We have the castle doctrine. If somebody's breaking into your house and you get out your gun and shoot them, that can be a defense against a murder charge, that they were breaking in, so you were acting in self-defense, and you are not guilty. The law doesn't have an innocent plea. Some people try it. It isn't a legal thing. You're either guilty or not guilty, and innocent just doesn't enter into the legal system. Anyway. But if it happens in daylight, the one who killed the thief is guilty of murder. Interesting. A thief who is caught must pay in full for everything he stole. If he cannot pay, he must be sold as a slave to pay for his theft. If someone steals an ox or a donkey or a sheep and it is found in the thief's possession, then the thief must pay double the value of the stolen animal. So, if you steal it and butcher it or sell it to somebody else where you can't get it back, then you do 5-fold restitution. If it's found in your possession and can be returned to the owner, it's only double restitution. If an animal is grazing in a field or vineyard and the owner lets it stray into someone else's field to graze, then the animal's owner must pay compensation from the best of his own grain or grapes. If you are burning thorn bushes and the fire gets out of control and spreads into another person's field, destroying the sheaves or the uncut grain or the whole crop, the one who started the fire must pay for the lost crop. Does that make you think of anything?
I'm sorry, I wasn't with you. I was back at a case I heard about where some people who raised cattle had started having cows disappear one at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And the police were able to find somebody and send him to prison over it.
Okay.
And what he was doing was he had a little roadside parked his truck on the side of the road, the highway, and put out a sign, beef for sale.
Mm-hmm.
So he was selling steaks and roasts and whatever.
He was using somebody else's animals to provide it.
He was stealing these cows to provide it. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's where I was. So I'm sorry, I don't
Okay,
know.
let me read you verse 6 again. If you are burning thorn bushes and the fire gets out of control and spreads into another person's field, destroying the sheaves or the uncut grain or the whole crop, the one who started the fire must pay for the lost crop.
Is that what Samson did when he tied those burning flames to the fox's tails?
Well, I doubt that he did. No, he was a one man destruction machine.
Yeah.
But I was thinking of something that happened right here at our house.
When the neighbor
Yeah.
lit a fire in his own backyard,
Uh huh.
and it took out our part of our deck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He and his son came over and replaced the burned deck skirting for us. So he was
Not being asked to.
right. He was good about it. He realized that it was his mistake, and you know our it burned our grass, but our grass grew back, so that wasn't
Well,
a big deal.
he was cleaning up his own backyard,
Yeah.
and he had a small fire. It was detained, and he went into the house just long enough to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
Well, when he got back out, he had to call fire department.
Yeah. So I got called at work, my wife telling me about all the excitement that's going on outside the window. Verse 7. Suppose someone leaves money or goods with a neighbor for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the neighbor's house. If the thief is caught, the compensation is double the value of what was stolen. But if the thief is not caught, the neighbor must appear before God, footnote D, before the judges, okay, who will determine if he stole the property. In other words, somebody leaves the stuff with you and you steal it, and then you say, oh, well, somebody stole it while I was asleep. Well, then the judges have to decide whether you stole it or not. Suppose there is a dispute between two people who both claim to own a particular ox, donkey, sheep, article of clothing, or any lost property. Both parties must come before God or before the judges, and the person whom the judges declare guilty must pay double compensation to the other. Declares, footnote E, before the judges and the person whom the judges declare. That's what I thought. Okay.
You think anybody would steal Bit-Bit?
I don't know. She never goes out.
I don't think anybody could get close to her.
Probably not. The other cat gets out. She never met a stranger, but every time she's gotten out, she's come back. Now, one time it took, 2 days for her to come back?
Yeah.
But most of the time we watch the door and try to keep her away from it so she doesn't get out, because it's not really good for her to be out. She doesn't know about cars and all this. Okay,
Now, what you were saying, if two people argue over who the animal belongs to, and I'm thinking, yeah, who's gonna be able to steal Bit-Bit?
Yeah. Okay. Verse 10. Now suppose someone leaves a donkey, ox, sheep, or any other animal with a neighbor for safekeeping, but it dies or is injured or is taken away, and no one sees what happened. The neighbor must then take an oath in the presence of Yahweh. If Yahweh confirms that the neighbor did not steal the property, the owner must accept the verdict and no payment will be required. But if the animal was indeed stolen, the guilty person must pay compensation to the owner. If it was torn to pieces by a wild animal, the remains of the carcass must be shown as evidence, and no compensation will be required. In other words, a wild animal captures and eats a domestic animal. It could happen whether it was in your field or your neighbor's field. No restitution is required in those cases. If someone borrows an animal from a neighbor and it is injured or dies when the owner is absent, the person who borrowed it must pay full compensation. But if the owner was present, no compensation is required. And no compensation is required if the animal was rented, for this loss is covered by the rental fee. Are these rules beginning to sound like the complicated rules that we humans generate until it takes walls and walls of books to contain just the code of federal regulations, much less all the laws of the different states and the different counties and municipalities around our country, until the law requires somebody with a same level of education as a doctor or even higher in order to deal with it? This is just the nature.
Some men cannot afford an attorney when they need one.
Yeah. And it's just the nature of written law. It becomes so complex, it becomes unmanageable. And we're seeing that happen to a limited extent even here, as these laws get ever more detailed and nitpicky, if you wish, in their application. Social responsibility. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged to anyone and has sex with her, he must pay the customary bride price and marry her. But if her father refuses to let him marry her, the man must still pay him an amount equal to the bride price of a virgin. In other words, you have sex with a woman, you have to pay the price, and it's up to her dad if you get her or if you don't. Verse 18, you must not allow a sorceress to live. And we referenced verses like that in our sermon presentation a couple of weeks ago, when we talked about the story of the slave girl who was telling the future and who was telling people that Paul and Silas were servants of the Most High God and so on.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the one that I think it was Saul went to.
Yeah, the Witch of Endor.
Yeah.
Anyone who has sexual relations with an animal must certainly be put to death. Anyone who sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed, other than Yahweh, in other words. Footnote F. I'm almost certain what that's going to tell us, but let's read it. The Hebrew term used here refers to the complete consecration of things or people to the Lord, either by destroying them or by giving them as an offering. Or as the NIV would put it, let's see if I can find that footnote. I went there for something else. Yes. The Hebrew term refers to the irrevocable giving over of things or persons to the Lord, often by totally destroying them. And my mind's going blank right now. I remember the term, the Hebrew term that's being used here, but I'm drawing a blank at the moment. So, but there is such a term, and it is referenced frequently here in the Old Testament. And this idea of total destruction, may be the Hebrew interpretation of what God was saying, because we just have that term and we know how the Hebrews used it, and we may not know what God initially intended for it to mean.
So, does God want us to destroy, or does he want to take, or does he want us to step back and let him destroy by allowing nature to take over?
Well, what is the reference that we find even in the Old Testament regarding vengeance? Vengeance belongs to who?
God.
Yeah. I will repay. Leave it to me. Now, some people will read that and say, vengeance belongs to God, so I get to kill you because I get vengeance on you. Well, that's not what the text means. It says, leave it to God. It belongs to God. Let him take care of it.
But what they say is,
Doesn't belong
God's
to you.
going to get him.
Huh?
What they'll say is, God's going to get him.
Well,
Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. That means
Yeah.
God's going to get him.
yeah.
Well, guess what? It doesn't mean that, does it?
Well, yeah, people say that
Vengeance.
it may be good that they can say that, because then they do leave it with God and they don't act out the violent intentions of their heart. But it doesn't help them, because the violent intention is still there in their heart and it still destroys them. Yeah. You must not mistreat or oppress foreigners in any way. Remember, you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. I wonder if the people who want to isolate the laws against homosexuality in the Old Testament, pretend like they're the be-all and end-all of biblical morality, would be willing to apply this verse in the same way. Particularly when it comes to this nation's borders and the people who keep wanting to come into our country. Just a thought. You must not exploit a widow or an orphan. If you exploit them in any way and they cry out to me, then I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will blaze against you, and I will kill you with a sword. Then your wives will be widows, and your children fatherless.
I think that also would apply to don't exploit someone who is divorced.
No. And think of that in the context of the time. This was a part of the world rent asunder frequently by war. And when we get into the history of the Israelite nation, farther on in the Old Testament, we'll see how many times they went to war against their neighbors. And what happens in war? Soldiers die. Who was soldiers back in that male chauvinistic age? Men. How did women end up widows and orphans? Well, very often it was because of the wars being fought.
Or stupidity.
Well,
They get drunk, and for sport, they get up, grab each other by the beard, and shove a sword in each other's side, and then fight to the death.
yeah,
For sport.
yeah. If you lend money to any of my people who are in need, do not charge interest as a moneylender would. Here's another law. If you want to be explicit about Old Testament law, what about this one? If they're of your own nationality, should you be charging them interest? Now, there are some versions who will interpret that as being don't take excessive interest. But you can go to the book of Nehemiah to find out what excessive interest is. You know what excessive interest was in the book of Nehemiah?
What?
The 100th part. 1/100th. What is that in percent?
I don't do math.
1%. Nehemiah was ringing people up as criminals for charging 1% interest. So if you're going to talk about excessive interest, Nehemiah considered 1% interest excessive. What does that say about the 5, 10, 15% interest that modern lenders charge their borrowers?
Well, let's look at where commerce came from in the beginning.
Came from Babylon, the Chaldeans.
Not something that God put in place.
So if you're suggesting, as we have been here, that these laws are laws to put limits on the problematic practices of the world around them, then the limitation here says don't charge interest at all. What would be the ideal? Don't loan money at all. If somebody needs it, give it to them. If you take your neighbor's cloak as security for a loan, you must return it before sunset. This coat may be the only blanket your neighbor has. How can a person sleep without it? If you do not return it and your neighbor cries out to me for help, then I will hear, for I am merciful. You must not dishonor God or curse any of your rulers. You must not hold anything back when you give me offerings from your crops and your wine. You must give me your firstborn sons. Well, that part we're familiar with because of the whole plague on the firstborn back in Egypt. Every firstborn son had to be redeemed. Firstborn animals couldn't be redeemed. They had to be offered as sacrifices. You must also give me the firstborn of your cattle, sheep, and goats, but leave the newborn animal with its mother for 7 days, then give it to me on the 8th day. You must be my holy people. Therefore, do not eat any animal that has been torn up and killed by wild animals. Throw it to the dogs. And as we go through, because we're going to run across a lot of rules as we go through this part of the Old
Let's
Testament.
look something about that.
What's that?
I can't verify this, and it's been years since I've heard it, so I'm sure it's skewed. But I heard something along the lines of you don't want to eat an animal that's been violently killed because it releases, when the animal is facing danger, it releases into its system some kind of chemical that makes the meat poisonous. But that really doesn't make sense, because if you're going to kill the animal, any kind of killing is going to be violent.
Well, the slaughter that the Hebrews were authorized to use, that's not what they always use, but it's what they were authorized to use, was to slit the animal's throat and let it bleed to death. And that is not nearly as violent. And some have suggested that the reason for that regulation was then all the fear chemicals were not pumped into the blood by the animal's fright. And
All
when
the
you
what?
what'd you say?
All the what?
All the fear chemicals, the adrenaline
what?
and so forth.
Fear what?
Chemicals.
Chemicals, okay.
Yeah. But you compare that to our modern system of animal slaughter, where we line them up in between gates and drive them through to a place where they get their heads bashed in order to kill them.
They know what's coming.
Yeah. So now their flesh is riddled with these fear chemicals, and like you say, we're poisoning ourselves when we eat that meat. Anyway, and that's some believe anyway, one of the reasons why the regulations against meat that still has the blood in it were made. And we remember when we were in the New Testament and we read in the book of Acts the few regulations that the new church leaders decided to impose on the Gentiles. One of them was from the meat of strangled animals and from the eating of blood. And we are at the end of chapter 22. So we got less than 2 chapters read, and we're at our hour and a half here. So we're going to call it quits for tonight. That's long enough, and we invite you to join us again next week. And yeah, this is a hard part of the Old Testament to get through because it's full of all these picky rules and regulations that are kind of hard sometimes for us to understand, and it's hard for us to read this and see the goodness of God in it, except as we understand that God is trying to limit the destructive practices of the culture around them. So we hope you'll join us again next week, and until that time, then we say goodbye and God bless.
Bye.